Ancient Mysteries and Secret Societies 1A, Atlantis and the Gods of Antiquity. He's done several favors in that line for me recently. It's a subject which, fortunately, I believe I can handle. The problem of Atlantis. I think there are a number of points that have not been generally considered. We think of Atlantis as an island, probably somewhere in the Atlantic and probably about in the location of the present Azores Islands, but actually, Atlantis was a diffusion. If you get a map now of the world as it is today, we can say that that is the modern distribution. But to have a map of Atlantis, as it was in the time of its glory, you would have to have a map of the entire planet, because it was a distributing continent. Continents rose and fell, islands came up and went down. Great land shifts occurred in the Atlantic. This distribution of land was far more important and far more far-reaching than the problem of an island somewhere in the ocean. So we have to think of Atlantis in relationship to a complete pattern of the planet, as Plato clearly pointed out. The island which we now think of as Atlantis was the last fragment of a great empire. It was the last surviving part, and it is supposed to have disappeared under the ocean about 12,000 years before the Trojan War, which would make it about 15,000 years ago. The name of Atlantis. In connection with the problem of Atlantis, I think the next thing we have to study is the name. Plato refers to the mysterious empire as Atlantis. He probably secured this name from Solon, who in turn had received it from the priests of the Egyptian temple of Sais. The word Atlantis is not Egyptian, and it is not Greek. No one seems to be able to trace the origin of the name. It appears on two very important phases of ancient mythology, Atlantis and Atlas, and the root is ATL. Now we look to find the language in which that word or that root is permissible or widely used. We finally have to come to the Western Hemisphere because that was one of the names of the Maya. It also has more than just a name significance. It's a symbol value. This seems to give us the real basis of our word, that we are dealing with a term that represents a world experience, that various countries were involved in it. The circumstances were known around the entire planet, and the name that has survived to us today is probably based upon the records on the Western Hemisphere. Now, if we take the general term to represent this mysterious region, we can find from the Codex Troano, which is in the museum in Madrid, one of the surviving documents of the Maya, that this particular deluge is marked in the glyphs. To the people, the story is told in pictures, but among these pictures, there is one in which the sky dragon, or the sky serpent, is pouring water from its mouth, and below this, the gods are dancing on the earth. This was a long time ago, and long before the coming of the Aztecs, but the records even go much further than that. Global Flood Legends and Atlantis. According to the Chinese, Runs, the previous existence before our present coming to this earth was destroyed. The previous world was destroyed by water, a tremendous deluge. And in the I Ching, the 8 trigrams, basic patterns, corresponding to Noah and his wife, and his 3 sons and their wives, who were saved. This is exactly what the Chinese tell us. So the story goes around here and there and everywhere. It's a very interesting story, but what does it really mean? Is it really an archaeological curiosity, or does it have some dynamic value for us today? I would like to think of Atlantis much as Bacon did in his book, The New Atlantis, in which he says in very simple terms, the New Atlantis, which is America. Bacon was quite convinced that on the Western Hemisphere, a great empire would arise, an empire that would surpass the glory of the Atlantean story, and that this new world would not be destroyed. It would not turn against the gods. It would not misuse the energy of nature, and as a result, would become a new world restoration of the Golden Age. Solon, Plato, and the Egyptian priests. When we study the Atlantean problem a little more carefully, we realize there have been a number of speculations on this. Vice President Donnelly made quite an extensive search for Atlantis in the world. A number of good archaeologists and ethnologists have devoted time to it, and the general attitude is no longer to treat it as a fable, but to try to find out what its actual meaning could be. Let us suppose that Solon was correct, and that being an old man, he was unable to do what he had intended to do, and that was to write out an account of the loss of Atlantis as he found it, or as it was given to him in the cave under the Temple of Egypt. Here, on columns formed of a metal that cannot perish, was recorded the story of the lost world. These tablets are sometimes referred to as the Tables of Hermes, and we find a great deal of mystical lore surrounding the story. In any event, Solon, being very old and unable to carry on the work, passed the legend on to one of his descendants, who was a student of Plato, and this student in turn told Plato, who took the story to use it as a great symbolic account of the design of man. Plato does not deny the story is literally true, but he does point out so many very subtle and unusual details that we are forced to realize that he embellished it to represent the entire story as a planet Earth and its development. The fall of the Atlantean Empire. At a remote time, the gods of Olympus distributed the world to their various deities, and Poseidon was given the lands of the sea, the great ocean, and the island. Poseidon created his kingdom in the ocean and created a wonderful city called the City of the Golden Gate. In the city there was a temple to him, and in this temple were the tablets containing the laws of life, the laws that must be obeyed if man is to survive and to enjoy the favors of the gods. The Atlantean Empire consisted of 7 islands. At least 7 islands also occur in the Mexican story. These islands came together to form a league, and this league created a kind of empire. In the course of ages, the princes of the islands of the Atlantic became very proud. They decided they would conquer the world. In order to achieve this great end, they decided to send expeditions of conquest over all the other parts of the Atlantean distribution. The distribution at that time consisted, as it does today, of countries of various degrees of development. It was not an uninhabited world. The Atlanteans were not the only people, but these other people were comparatively primitive. They were like the natives of Africa or the natives of some Polynesian area. They were primitive people, but they existed, and the Atlantean merchants went to them, traded with them, and bartered with them. Plato states definitely that Atlantis had a great mercantile fleet that traveled to all parts of the world, that it even visited Europe and as far south as South America. But gradually, this empire grew more and more proud. Gradually, fame, wealth, and power became the great objectives of life. Misuse of power and destruction. There was another dimension. These people possessed extrasensory perceptions that had not been closed by the process of embodiment. They were like the extrasensory perceptions of small children, whose faculties are partly active in our time. So anyway, these magicians, these sorcerers, these powerful ones, possessed vril. Vril being the one stored power that is inexhaustible, something we could use today that could carry anything, transport anything, activate anything that the human being could conceive. And so, in their pride, these princesses decided near the end of their time to invade what is now Europe. They decided to invade the areas of the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Near East. So they sent a great fleet to conquer these countries. In the meantime, the deities, particularly Poseidon, realizing what was occurring, gave warnings and prophets and told these people they were destroying themselves, but they were proud, and they gave no mind or no thought to the consequences. Finally, they rebelled against the gods, and the god reacted accordingly. In a single night, the great center of the Atlantean culture, the island, the last surviving fragment of an ancient order of life, disappeared under the ocean. According to the Maya calendar, it carried with it to death 60 million human beings. This was the end of a great cycle of infuses and abuses, in which those powers, forces, and principles which had been intended to be a common good to all mankind were perverted, and in one way or another, turned against the will of heaven, and the consequence was, they were destroyed. Atlantean missionaries, and the dawn of civilization. Now this also causes us to have another little interlude here, that I think we should give a thought to. We are talking about Plato, and several other historians of that time, that various agencies, various merchant travelers, and explorers from Atlantis visited other lands. And among those who visited other lands were the priests of the Atlanteans, those who worshipped the great golden serpent. Serpent worship was one of the oldest religions of the world. These various missionaries, shall we say, went to primitive people, as we send missionaries today to underprivileged or gradually evolving groups. These missionaries set up various institutions in the distant parts of the empire, which were not actually destroyed by the destruction of the central land. It seems to me, and I realize that this is hypothetical, that this explains a series of legends and myths which are of interest. We are told, for example, the people of Chaldea and Babylonia were very primitive. They had not yet discovered fire. They did not know how to cook food. They did not know how to keep records. They had no medicine or medical knowledge. They had no laws to live by, no government except tribal commune. And in the midst of all this time, while they were living along the shores of the sea, one day something strange happened. A being came out of the sea. This being, whom they called Oans, had the body and face, and the head of a human being, and wore on his head the head of a fish. If you see the old pictures, you realize that his hat was what we call today an ornamental mitre, which is practically exactly the shape of a fish head. This man who came out of the sea had scales. Those scales could very well represent armor. He carried symbols with him, and he was a good man. He came to these people. He talked to them. He gave them a written language. He gave them the knowledge of agriculture. He taught them astronomy and the history of the stars. He helped them to build a permanent government, introduced them into the mysteries of architecture and the building of cities, and he also taught them the mysteries of heaven and the age of the gods, and to live in obedience. And he told them that in due time he would return. And then he went back to the sea, promising to come back one of these days, sometime in the near future, and he walked out into the sea and disappeared. It seems to me this could be a story of an Atlantean traveler or missionary perhaps who came to these people, very much as the Romans coming along the coast of Britain and France gave them the beginnings of the culture of the Druids. This one who came out of the sea, wearing armor, probably came on a ship which came over the horizon and was regarded as evidence that he came out of the sea. The most important thing is his promise to return. So they waited, and they kept his laws and they kept his rules for years, but he never came back. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. On the opposite side of the world, something else was happening. The people of Central America were living in a very primitive state. Some of them were cannibals. They had no homes except rude huts. They had no instruments except those cut from stone. They did not know how to cook their food. They had no written language, or no way of recording their history, no knowledge of any of these things. And while they lived in this primitive condition, a strange thing happened. An old man came to them, riding on the back of a serpent, and he came to the shore and was welcomed by them. His name is preserved in the 3 great languages of the central culture of that period in time and place. To the Aztecs, it was Quetzalcoatl. To the Quiches, the ones who lived around Palenque, it was Kukulkan. And to the Mayas, he was the feathered serpent. This man came from the sea with a headdress, a wonderful plume, almost like wings, and on his breast he carried a cross. He came to them, and they received him with regard and honor. He taught them all the things that Oannes taught to the Chaldeans. He helped them to establish a permanent way of life. He gave them the beginnings of a written language, the only written language in the Western Hemisphere. He gave them good government. And then he said, "Now I go away, but keep the rules that I've given you, and in due time I will return and claim the empire. But that means you must obey the principles I have taught." These principles were of very high quality, morally and ethically. Then this being went to the shores of the sea, and as he stood there, he said to the people assembled that a very bad power was coming to them. The god of war was going to come from the south to destroy their empire. They should be true, however. They should keep the rules. And then he would return. There are 2 accounts of what happened to him. One is that he rode the sea, and the raft of the serpent returned. The serpent could well be a ship with the animal heads that were engraved or carved on the heads of ships. The other explanation is that he was transfigured and rose to become immortalized and deified in the planet Venus. He said, "I will come back," but he never came. And then many centuries later, when the Spanish ships anchored, the Aztec Emperor Montezuma sent an ambassador to the court, saying that the long-promised king was returning to claim the kingdom which his people had kept trustworthy for ages. Extraterrestrials versus pre-existing civilizations. In the last few years, there's been a great deal of emphasis upon extraterrestrials visiting our planet. Books have been written to show how somebody from outer space presumably came long ago and produced all kinds of mysterious monuments, records, engravings, pictures, and carvings. This idea is said to have come from outer space, but outer space has certain difficulties involved that have not been completely solved. It may all be true, but what we have overlooked is the possibility that these records that we now consider to arise from extraterrestrial sources could be the records of the great civilizations that were here before they destroyed themselves. These people who are said to have come and brought all the secrets of life to these primitive people could have been the citizens of the great Atlantean Empire, an empire that was far higher and far more advanced in many ways even than we are today. Their civilization was different. They were not bound tremendously to an industrial program. They didn't need it. We wouldn't need it if we developed the resources within ourselves. The main foundation of our belief is that something happened by which a culture came here or was here prior to our ability to produce it. If we assume that there was a great source already here, it makes it much easier to account for the travels of these mysterious visitors. Suppose these mysterious visitors were simply part of an advanced culture here. The lessons of Atlantis and final thoughts. The important truth that the destruction of Atlantis, recorded on the tables of Enoch, left is the great story of the disaster of disobedience. Regardless of how we think about life, what we believe about life, it is impossible for us to go contrary to the will of heaven. Anything that goes contrary comes in the end to destruction. This may be the submerged part of man's own nature, that part which was lost because of disobedience to the God. This may be the widespread mystery of the fall of man, which has been recorded in various ways among practically all people of the earth. The story of the fall is very loudly a record of disobedience. The individual has broken the rules of life. Some people, having broken the rules of life, try to study esoteric matters, hoping to find the secret of some strange magic of long ago. But if they are those who have broken the rules and are seeking a magic which they do not deserve and which they do not have the character to use constructively, they could cause another catastrophe upon the face of the earth. The old masters of the magic of Atlantis lost all by perversion. They lost themselves, and they lost their lives. They lost their world, and their beautiful cities and their temples. Nothing remained, because they failed. The moral of the great Atlantean experiment was that man should learn to know all that is possible for man to know.